The psychological game married men play, exposed, Carl Jung. Have you ever noticed how some married men seem to live two completely different lives? During the day, they are devoted husbands, present fathers, respectable professionals. But there's something going on beneath that surface, a silent psychological game that most people never identify. And the most disturbing, many don't even realize they're playing. Maria found out the hard way. After 12 years of marriage, she found messages on her husband's cell phone that didn't make sense. They were not physical betrayals, but something more complex. A version of him she had never met. He wasn't just hiding secrets. He was living in a parallel psychological reality, creating personas that even he didn't fully understand. Today, we are going to expose the hidden mechanisms of this dynamic. It's not about moral judgment, but about understanding the unconscious patterns that govern seemingly inexplicable behaviors. What you will discover here can completely change the way you see relationships and, especially, how you identify the signs before it is too late. 1. The double husband, the persona, no one sees at home. There is a version of your husband that only appears far away from you. At work, he's charismatic, funny, that guy everyone wants around. With friends, he becomes someone uninhibited, full of strong opinions and endless stories. But when he crosses the door of his house, something changes. The energy disappears. The sparkle in his eyes goes out. He becomes a silent, distant stranger, as if he were fulfilling only an obligation. This division does not happen by chance. Since we were children, we have learned to wear social masks to be accepted. The problem arises when these masks become more real than our own identity. The married man often constructs a public version of himself so elaborate that he forgets who he really is. This external version receives all the applause, all the validation. Meanwhile, at home, where he should be safe to be authentic, he feels too exposed, too vulnerable. What makes this a psychological game is unconsciousness. He genuinely does not realize that he is living in fragmentation. He believes that the charming version of the office is fake and the apathetic version of home is true. Or worse, he begins to resent the domestic environment because he does not receive the same recognition there. The wife sees his flaws, his moments of weakness, his raw humanity, and this becomes unbearable for those who have built an entire identity based on external approval. The cruelty of this mechanism lies in the fact that the person closest to it, you, ends up receiving only the remains, the tired, angry, disinterested version. Meanwhile, co-workers, casual acquaintances, and even strangers on the internet get the best of it. It is not a conscious choice of disrespect. It is an automatic pattern where he associates home with obligation and the external world with freedom. Home becomes the place where he no longer needs to impress, so he simply shuts down. And this disconnect creates an emotional chasm that silently grows day after day until they both wake up strangers to each other. 2. The projection game, when he blames you for his own emptiness. Have you ever noticed how certain discussions never make sense? He accuses you of being controlling when you only asked about the weekend's plans. He says that you are distant when he was the one who spent the whole week on his cell phone. He claims that you have changed, that you are no longer the person you married, but when he questions what has changed, he cannot explain it. This confusion has a name: psychological projection. Projection happens when someone attributes to another person feelings, desires, or characteristics that actually belong to themselves. It's an unconscious defense mechanism that protects us from facing uncomfortable truths about ourselves. For the married man stuck in this pattern, it becomes easier to see faults in you than to admit his own internal conflicts. He's not deliberately lying. He's genuinely convinced that the problem is outside of him. When he accuses you of emotional coldness, he may be running away from his own inability to feel and express affection. When he complains that you don't understand him, maybe it's because he himself doesn't understand what he feels. This dynamic creates a devastating cycle. The more you try to explain yourself or change to meet his accusations, the more he finds new faults. Because the real problem was never you. The most painful aspect of this situation is that you begin to doubt your own sanity. After months or years of hearing that it is difficult, demanding, unsatisfied, it begins to internalize these narratives. He starts to question every reaction, every feeling, every legitimate need. Meanwhile, he remains comfortably protected from any real self-reflection. The projection works as a perfect shield that keeps intact the image he has of himself, while you carry the emotional weight of two. And the relationship turns into a minefield where you never know which twisted version of reality will be presented next. If you want to understand the psychological game married men play and why you keep getting pulled into it without noticing, the Jung method is pinned in the first comment. 3. The secret search for the lost mother. Many married men are unconsciously looking for something they missed out on in childhood, the perfect connection with the mother figure. We are not talking about an obvious complex or explicit childish behaviors. It is something much more subtle and dangerous. He seeks in his wife that unconditional acceptance, that unquestioning care, that feeling of being the center of someone's universe, just as he felt or wished to feel in his mother's arms. As a child, many boys are raised to believe that their emotional needs will always be met without them having to ask. The mother anticipates, resolves, protects. They grow up expecting this pattern to continue into adulthood. They marry expecting their wives to assume this role of unconditional emotional caregiver. But the conjugal reality requires reciprocity, shared responsibility, mutual effort. And that creates a devastating shock. The problem arises when he realizes, even if unconsciously, that you are not the idealized mother. You have your own needs. You question, disagree, have bad days. You are a complete person, not an extension of it. This discovery generates deep frustration, although he never admits or even understands what he is feeling. He begins to see you as a failure, as someone who does not fulfill the expected role. And often, at this point, the temptation arises to look elsewhere for that fantasy. Other women start to seem more understanding, more welcoming, more perfect, precisely because they do not live with his daily reality. They don't see their weaknesses, they don't hold them accountable, they don't break the illusion. They become perfect projections of that idealized maternal figure that he is still looking for. Meanwhile, you, who know his imperfections and share with him the weight of real life, are unconsciously punished for simply being human. This pattern destroys relationships because it places an impossible expectation on you to be simultaneously a partner, lover, and perfect mother to a grown man. Bazudish tu su 4. The silent terror of being really seen. True intimacy is scary. It seems contradictory after all. We all say we want deep connection, to be understood, to have someone who knows us completely. But when this possibility becomes real, many men panic, because to be truly seen means to expose the parts that we spend our whole lives trying to hide, including from ourselves. During courtship and early marriage, there is a period of enchantment where everything seems safe. He opens up, shares dreams, fears, vulnerabilities. You believe you are building genuine intimacy, but something changes when the relationship deepens. The more you get to know him, the more he moves away. Not physically at first, but emotionally. It creates invisible barriers, changes the subject when the conversation gets too personal, hides behind work, hobbies, screens. This movement happens because real intimacy requires him to confront aspects of himself that he has chosen to bury. Maybe it's deep insecurity disguised as confidence. Perhaps they are desires that do not align with the image he has built. Maybe it's simply the fear that you're not enough, that if you really know him, you'll go away. So he does the opposite of what he should. He moves away first, keeps control of the distance, protects himself from the rejection that he imagines inevitable. This dynamic creates a peculiar loneliness within the marriage. You are there, available, wanting to connect, but you only find closed doors. He complains about loneliness too, but he doesn't realize that he is the architect of his own isolation. Each time you try to get closer, he finds subtle ways to sabotage you. A joke that diverts the subject, a sudden irritation, a sudden tiredness. Over time, you learn not to try anymore. And then they both exist side by side, sharing space but living separate worlds, two strangers fulfilling roles in a script that no one believes anymore. 5. The fantasy of freedom. What he really wants to escape. There is a recurring fantasy in the minds of many married men, the life they would have had if they had not committed. In this imaginary version, they are free, unhindered, living adventures without limits. They travel when they want, they go out with whomever they want, they don't need explanations or negotiations. This fantasy becomes so vivid, so attractive, that it begins to poison the present reality. What makes this a psychological game is that this fantasy freedom does not exist. It never existed. Even though he was single, he had responsibilities, limitations, fears. But the human mind has an uncanny ability to idealize what it doesn't have while devaluing what it has. Marriage becomes the imaginary prison. You become the involuntary prisoner, and he sees himself as the victim of choices he himself made. This mindset manifests itself in subtle ways. Nostalgic comments about the time of singleness, constant complaints about family obligations, disproportionate irritation when he needs to consult you about decisions. These are not necessarily signs that he wants to end the relationship, but evidence of an internal battle between adult responsibility and fantasy of eternal freedom. What he really wants to escape is not you or the marriage itself. It is the confrontation with your own mortality, your irreversible choices, the closure of infinite possibilities. The compromise represents the end of an era where anything was still possible. And this is deeply frightening. Then he projects this existential anguish into the relationship, believing that regaining external freedom will solve the internal discomfort. But men who abandon families in pursuit of this fantasy often discover, too late, that they carry the prison within them. The dissatisfaction was not in the circumstances, but in the refusal to mature emotionally. And no amount of external freedom heals an internal prison. 6. The inner saboteur. Why he destroys what he has built. Have you ever seen him build something good and then systematically destroy it? Maybe it was months planning a trip, but in the last week he gets into absurd fights, or moments of genuine connection followed by days of inexplicable coldness. It seems that whenever things get better, something inside him needs to screw it up. It's no coincidence. It is unconscious sabotage. Many men grow up with an internal narrative that they don't deserve happiness, success, or true love. It could be messages from childhood, unprocessed trauma, or simply constant comparisons that made them feel inadequate. These beliefs burrow so deep that they become invisible, but they continue to operate behind the scenes of the psyche, sabotaging anything good that comes along. When the relationship is good, when you are happy and show love, something inside it sets off an alarm. This can't last. You don't deserve this. It's better to destroy it now before she finds out who you really are and abandons you. So he creates crises. He finds reasons to fight. He becomes critical, distant, provocative, tests the limits of your patience and love. And if you eventually walk away or respond angrily, he confirms to himself, "See, I knew it. I don't deserve to be loved." This pattern is devastating because it is a self-fulfilling cycle. The more he sabotages, the more problems he creates. The more problems there are, the more justification he has to believe that the relationship is doomed, and you're stuck on this emotional roller coaster, never knowing if you'll have the loving husband or the saboteur. The tragedy is that underneath all this destruction, there is usually someone terrified of being loved, because true love requires vulnerability, and vulnerability brings risk of loss. It is safer to destroy by one's own hands than to expect to be destroyed by circumstances. 7, the imaginary woman, competing with those who do not exist. The most dangerous rival in a marriage is not always another real woman. Often, it's an idealized version that exists only in his head. This imaginary woman is everything you are not. If you're an extrovert, she's mysterious. If you are organized, it is spontaneous. If you demonstrate needs, she is perfectly independent. This impossible figure becomes the standard against which you are constantly measured and always lose. This ideal woman never ages, never has a bad mood, never gets sick or tired. She understands perfectly without him having to explain. She desires exactly when he desires. She admires every word, every gesture, every idea. Of course, this perfection only exists because it is not real. But in his mind, it becomes so concrete that it influences how he sees you. You notice when this happens. He makes subtle comparisons. So-and-so at the gym is always so lively, or her friend's wife never complains about anything. She shows excessive interest in movie characters, digital influencers, or even co-workers, not necessarily sexual, but as if they represented something that was missing at home. You start to feel like it's never enough, because you're competing with a fantasy. The problem is that costumes don't have imperfections, while real people do. You have bad days, opinions of your own, needs that sometimes conflict with his. You are three-dimensional, complex, human. And against a two-dimensional projection of perfection, there is no way to win. This psychological game is especially cruel because he may even claim that he loves you. But this love is always accompanied by a silent but. He loves, but dreams of different. He stays, but imagines alternatives. And you feel that foot in the door, that ghostly presence that hovers over the relationship as a constant reminder that you, with all your real humanity, will never be enough to fulfill an ideal that shouldn't even exist. 8. The forced awakening, when the mask finally falls. There comes a time when everything falls apart. It could be a midlife crisis, a significant loss, an illness, or simply the accumulation of years of fragmented living. The masks he wore for decades are starting to crack. And for the first time, perhaps in adulthood, he is forced to look at himself without filters, without protections, without excuses. That awakening is rarely pretty. This process usually begins with symptoms that he does not understand. Inexplicable anxiety, a feeling of emptiness even when everything seems fine externally, self-destructive impulses, crying spells for no apparent reason. It is the unconscious screaming, finally demanding to be heard. All those repressed aspects, all those swallowed emotions, all those avoided truths now knock on the door, demanding attention. For the wife, this period can be extremely confusing. Suddenly he wants to talk about feelings after years of silence, or the opposite, it explodes emotionally in completely non-standard ways. He can become depressed, questioning, philosophically lost. Some men at this stage make drastic changes. They quit jobs, end relationships, seek extreme experiences, desperately try to feel something real. The forced awakening can destroy the marriage or save it, depending on the courage of both. if he is willing to actually do the inner work, to confront his shadows, to take responsibility for destructive patterns, to learn genuine vulnerability, there is a possibility of profound transformation. But if you use this crisis as a justification to run away even more, destroying everything in search of an external magical solution, you will only repeat the same patterns in new scenarios. For you who are living this or recognizing these patterns, the crucial question is, how far does your willingness to stay go while he discovers who he really is? Because this awakening, while necessary, is not your responsibility to create or manage. You can support it, but you can't do it for him. And sometimes the healthiest decision is to allow him to face his truths alone, while you protect your own emotional integrity. Because in the end, each one has to decide whether they want to live authentically or keep playing psychological games until there is nothing real left to save.